Today we're talking about the idea that waiting is surrendering control. The question that I want to tackle for us today is, what does it mean to surrender control in our life? I think this is going to be one of the most challenging things for us to practice because it really involves taking a leap of faith. It really involves letting go and allowing God to take control of things in our lives. And for a lot of us, that can be really, really scary. Through the story that we're going to be reading today, we're going to see how it was ultimately worth it. Has anybody ever heard of or read the story of Joseph in the Bible? This is a story of a guy who has dreams, and he was given these prophetic dreams, meaning that they would come true one day, and he goes and he tells his brothers about them, and his brothers get so upset that they try to have him killed but settle on selling him into slavery. God had used everything for a greater purpose. Even as terrible as it was being sold into slavery, God had a purpose for it. Even as terrible as it was getting falsely accused of these horrific things, God had a purpose behind it. And even with a great famine of that size, as terrible as that is, God had a purpose for it. And so Joseph realizes this, and he says this in Genesis chapter 45. He says, "Do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. It was not you who sent me here, but God." So there's three things, if you guys are paying attention here, that happen. One, Joseph forgives his brothers, the ones who betrayed him and they were angry at him and did all those terrible things to him. The second thing is that Joseph is able to save his family from the famine. And the last thing is that Joseph acknowledges God's hand in everything that happened. Everything that happened to him, Joseph realizes. And this is where, if you guys look in your Bibles, Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, he says this: "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Can I say that one more time? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. It's so fascinating to me to see this verse lived out in such a way where Joseph comes to this conclusion where it says, even though you intended to do wrong against me, even though you did these bad things to me, God had a greater purpose in mind, and he used it to accomplish his good. So for us, waiting is surrendering control. We still have to make the active decision that we will surrender to God in the midst of the waiting. Because as we talked about last week, we talked about being still and acknowledging God. It is possible to acknowledge God and not submit to him. It is possible to look at him and recognize that he is real and that he's a part of your life, but then to not yield to his hand in your life. And if you're in a season of waiting where he's inviting you to give up control and to surrender these things to him, it is going to be so incredibly difficult. But what we see in the life of Joseph is that he did not try to force his hand. He did not try to make it right himself, but he had to. He had to trust that God was going to do what he said he was going to do. He had to trust that even though people intended to harm him, and they probably did in the process, God used those things for good. Joseph could not see the bigger picture, but he had to trust that God did, and that ultimately everything that happened to him was leading to a specific reason.